Gracie Rogers learned 3 things in 5 minutes that would incinerate her life. First, she was pregnant. Second, the father wasn't just the wealthy heir she worked for. He was Sung-min Boram, the cold-blooded head of Seoul's most feared crime syndicate. Third, she wasn't as good at keeping secrets as she thought. Gracie stood trembling in the Incheon airport terminal, her passport clutched in a white-knuckled grip. She was 5 feet from the gate, 5 feet from taking the Boram heir across the ocean where he'd never find them. Then the terminal went silent. The crowd parted like an opening wound, and there he was. Sung-min Boram looked like a god of war in a charcoal suit, his dark eyes tracking her like a predator. "You're late for your shift, Gracie," he murmured, his voice a low, melodic threat. He stepped into her space, his hand resting, heavy and possessive, directly over her belly. "You didn't think you could take my blood across the ocean, did you?" Gracie's heart slammed against her ribs. She looked for help, but the security guards looked away. She was already caught. "I don't belong to you," she whispered. Sung-min's jaw tightened. "Yesterday, you were the maid, but today, you are carrying the Boram legacy, and in my world, we never let our legacy walk away." He leaned in, his scent of sandalwood and rain caging her in. "You can come with me and live in a palace, or stay here and wait for my enemies to find you. Trust me, they won't be as gentle as I am." Gracie looked at the exit, then at her captor, and realized her freedom was gone. She was his, and the real storm was just beginning. The black sedan glided through the iron gates of the Boram estate with a predatory silence, the gravel crunching beneath the tires like breaking bone. Gracie sat in the back, her fingers tracing the velvet upholstery, a sharp contrast to the rough cotton of the uniforms she had worn for 3 years. Beside her, Sung-min was a statue of tailored wool and cold intent. He didn't look at her, but his hand remained firmly on her thigh, a touch that felt less like comfort and more like a brand. As the car pulled up to the grand entrance, the massive double doors swung open. Usually, Gracie entered through the service gate in the rear, smelling of laundry detergent and citrus floor wax. Today, the entire household staff, nearly 30 people, were lined up in the foyer in 2 perfect, terrifying rows. The heavy car door was opened by a security detail, and Sung-min stepped out first, extending a hand to Gracie. She hesitated, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When she finally took it, his grip was crushing. He led her up the marble steps, her red dress flowing around her legs like spilled wine. The moment they crossed the threshold, the air in the foyer shifted. These were people Gracie had scrubbed floors alongside. There was Mrs. Park, the head housekeeper, who once docked Gracie's pay for a streak on a window, and Min Ho, the junior butler, who had made cruel jokes about her accent in the staff break room. "Bow," commanded Sung-min. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. Simultaneously, every person in the hall bent at the waist, their heads dropping in a deep, submissive arc. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of Gracie's own ragged breathing. She felt a surge of nausea. She was still the same woman who had been hiding a pregnancy test in her apron pocket that morning, yet the world around her had warped into something unrecognizable. "From this moment," Sung-min addressed the bowed heads, his gaze sweeping over them with icy detachment. "Gracie Rogers is the mistress of this house. Her word is my word. Her safety is the only priority. If I hear so much as a whisper of disrespect, or if she sheds a single tear because of a failure in this household, I will personally ensure you never work in this city again, if you are lucky enough to remain in it at all." He didn't wait for a response. He led her past the bowed backs, toward the grand staircase. Gracie felt their eyes on her, not with the camaraderie of fellow workers, but with a sharp, jagged fear.
Instead of turning toward the servants' wing in the attic, Sung-min led her to the highest floor, to the master suite. He pushed open the heavy mahogany doors to a room that was larger than her entire apartment in Houston. The walls were lined with silk, the floor covered in hand-woven rugs, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the glowing Seoul skyline. "This is your home now," Sung-min said, finally releasing her hand. He walked over to a sideboard and poured a glass of water, bringing it to her. "The staff has already moved your things from the quarters. The rest has been burned." Gracie took the glass, her hands shaking. "You burned my clothes? My books?" "They were remnants of a life that no longer exists," he replied, stepping closer until he eclipsed the light from the window. He reached out, his thumb brushing her lower lip. "You were a ghost in this house, Gracie, a shadow that cleaned up after me. But you're carrying my son now. Shadows don't give birth to kings." Gracie looked around the opulent room, feeling the walls closing in. The master suite wasn't just a bedroom, it was a command center, a sanctuary, and a cage. "They hate me, Sung-min. The staff, they know what I am. They know I was just the maid yesterday." "They don't hate you," Sung-min corrected softly, his eyes flashing with a dark, primal intensity. "They are terrified of you, because they know that one word from you can end them, and they should be." He moved behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his palms flat against her stomach. He leaned his head against her shoulder, his breath hot against her neck.
"Rest now. Tomorrow the world finds out who you are, and I promise you, Gracie, everyone will bow." Gracie closed her eyes, leaning back against his chest. She had wanted to escape the tiger, only to find herself being cradled in its jaws. She wasn't a maid anymore, but as she looked at her reflection in the gilded mirror, she wondered if she would ever truly be free again. The morning sun had barely touched the glass of the master suite when the door opened. There was no knock, only the heavy, certain presence of Sung-min Borum. Gracie had been awake for hours, curled on the edge of the silk-sheeted bed, staring at the walk-in closet filled with designer clothes that felt like costumes for a play she hadn't auditioned for. "Dress," Sung-min commanded, tossing a shopping bag onto the mattress. "We leave in 10 minutes." He didn't explain where. He didn't have to. In this house, his silence was the law. Gracie dressed in a soft, charcoal gray cashmere dress that hugged her small bump, her hands trembling as she pulled her hair back. She felt like a doll being readied for display, but the look in Sung-min's eyes when he saw her wasn't one of admiration, it was hunger. They traveled in a 3-car convoy, the city of Seoul blurring past the tinted windows. They didn't go to a public hospital. Instead, the cars pulled into a sleek, unmarked building in Gangnam, a private clinic that looked more like a fortress. Armed men stood at the entrance, bowing low as Sung-min led Gracie inside by the small of her back. The clinic was silent, smelling of expensive air purifiers and antiseptic. A doctor in a pristine white coat was already waiting, his face pale and his hands steady only by force of will. "Mr. Borum," the doctor bowed, "everything is prepared." Gracie was led to a darkened room filled with glowing monitors. As she lay back on the cold exam table, she felt a sudden sharp spike of vulnerability. She was exposed, her stomach bared, while Sung-min stood in the corner, his shadow stretching across the floor. He looked out of place in the clinical setting, a man of violence in a room dedicated to life. The doctor applied the cool gel, and the transducer moved across her skin. At first, there was only static, gray and white blurs that made no sense to Gracie's panicked mind. She held her breath, her eyes darting to Sung-min.
He was perfectly still, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of granite. Then the sound filled the room. Thump-thump, thump-thump, thump-thump.
It was fast, rhythmic, and incredibly loud. On the screen, a tiny flickering light appeared in the center of a dark circle. "There," the doctor whispered, pointing to the screen. "The heartbeat." The shift in the room was instantaneous. Gracie felt a tear slip down her temple, a mixture of pure maternal relief and overwhelming terror. But it was Sungmin's reaction that stopped her heart. The man who had ordered executions without blinking moved toward the bed. His hand, usually so steady on the grip of a weapon, reached out tentatively. He didn't look at Gracie. His gaze was fused to the flickering light on the monitor. As he leaned in, the harsh light of the screen caught his eyes, and for the first time, the ice was gone. In its place was a look of such raw, primal obsession that it made Gracie's skin crawl. It wasn't the look of a father seeing a miracle. It was the look of a conqueror seeing his crown. "That is mine," Sungmin murmured, his voice sounding like a rasp against stone. He reached down and placed his hand over Gracie's stomach, his fingers splaying wide. His touch was no longer just possessive, it was transformative. The coldness had been replaced by a heat so intense it felt like it could burn through her. He looked down at her then, and the expression on his face terrified her more than his anger ever had. "Do you hear that, Gracie?" he whispered, his eyes dark and dilated. "That is the heartbeat of the Boram legacy. That is the only thing in this world that matters." He leaned closer, his face inches from hers, caging her in with his body. "If a single beat skips, if a single person so much as breathes wrong in your direction, I will burn this city to the ground to find out why." The doctor hurried to print the sonogram photos, his movements frantic. Sungmin took them the moment they emerged, staring at the grainy black and white images as if they were holy relics. He didn't put them in his pocket. He held them delicately, his thumb tracing the shape of the life inside her. As they walked back to the car, the air felt heavier. The protection Sungmin had offered before was now something else, an absolute suffocating claim. Gracie realized then that she wasn't just carrying a baby, she was carrying the only thing Sungmin Boram had ever truly loved, and he would destroy the entire world, including her, to keep it. The following week, the atmosphere within the Boram estate shifted from cold surveillance to a suffocating tension. Gracie was no longer allowed to leave the master suite without a 4-man security detail, and every meal she consumed was prepared by a personal chef under the watchful eye of Sungmin's lead guard. She felt less like a mother and more like a holy relic being guarded by wolves. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when a courier arrived with a package wrapped in heavy, cream-colored silk. It was delivered directly to the master suite, accompanied by a handwritten note on expensive vellum. The gift was from Sungmin's younger brother, Jin-sung, the man who stood to lose the most if Gracie's child was born healthy. "To the woman who has brought a miracle to our house," the note read. "A traditional herbal tea to ease the morning sickness of the mother of our future." Gracie sat at the small ivory table near the window, the ornate wooden box of dried herbs and dark tea leaves sitting before her. To a girl from Houston, it looked like an olive branch, a sign that perhaps the family was beginning to accept her presence. She had spent 3 years as a maid, invisible and unwanted. The idea of being welcomed felt like a light at the end of a very dark tunnel. She had just poured the steaming water into a porcelain cup when the door to the suite was thrown open.
Sung-min stepped inside, his jacket discarded, his tie loosened as if he had been in the middle of a heated war council. He stopped dead, his eyes zeroing in on the steam rising from the cup. "What is that?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "A gift from your brother," Gracie replied, startled by the sudden intrusion. "He sent a special tea for the pregnancy. I was just about to—" In a blur of movement that Gracie couldn't follow, Sung-min was across the room. He didn't take the cup from her, he backhanded it off the table. The porcelain shattered against the wall, staining the white silk wallpaper with a dark, ugly smear. Gracie scrambled back, her hand flying to her stomach. "Sung-min, what are you—" He didn't answer her. He grabbed the wooden box of tea leaves, his knuckles white. He didn't need a lab test to know the scent of dong quai and black cohosh in concentrations high enough to act as a silent assassin. He turned toward the door, his face a mask of such concentrated fury that Gracie felt the temperature in the room drop. "Stay here," he ordered. It wasn't a command, it was a growl. "Do not open this door for anyone but me." He stormed out, and for the first time, Gracie heard the sound of the master suite being locked from the outside. Below, in the grand formal dining room where the high-ranking members of the Borum Syndicate were gathered for a midday briefing, the doors were kicked off their hinges. Sung-min entered the room like a dark storm, the wooden tea box in his hand. At the far end of the long mahogany table, Jin-sung sat, a smug, tight smile playing on his lips that vanished the moment he saw his brother's face. Without a word, Sung-min walked to the head of the table. He didn't go for his gun. Instead, he grabbed his brother by the throat, hoisting him out of the chair with a strength fueled by pure, unadulterated rage. The other syndicate members scrambled back, chairs screeching against the floor, but no one dared to intervene. "You thought you could touch her?" Sung-min hissed, his voice vibrating with a lethal frequency. "You thought you could reach into her womb and steal what is mine?" He slammed the tea box onto the table, the dried herbs spilling out like ash. He forced Jin-sung's face down toward the leaves. "Eat it," Sung-min commanded. "Brother, it was just—" Jin-sung gasped, clawing at the hand crushing his windpipe. "Eat it!" Sung-min roared, the sound echoing through the mansion like a gunshot. When Jin-sung hesitated, Sung-min didn't hesitate. He drew his ceremonial dagger from its sheath on the table and drove the point into the wood an inch from his brother's eye. The message was clear. There was no brotherly love left in this room. There was only the boss and a traitor. "This is the last time blood is spilled in this house that isn't yours," Sung-min whispered, his eyes dark with a terrifying, obsessive fire. "If my child so much as hiccups because of your shadow, I will not just kill you. I will erase every trace that you ever existed. I will salt the earth where you walked." He threw Jin-sung across the room like a piece of discarded trash. Turning to the silent, terrified man of the syndicate, Sung-min straightened his cuffs, his composure returning, though his eyes remained predatory. "Gracie Rogers is the Borum name," he announced to the room. "The child she carries is the heartbeat of this family. Anyone who forgets that will find out exactly how much I am willing to sacrifice to protect what is mine." When he finally returned to the master suite, he found Gracie huddled on the sofa. He didn't apologize for the broken porcelain or the locked door. He simply sat beside her, pulled her into his lap, and buried his face in the crook of her neck. He held her with a grip that was almost painful, a silent promise that he would become the monster the world feared, just to keep her safe. Gracie realized then that the tea wasn't the only thing that was poisonous. The love Sung-min felt was a toxin of its own, violent, absolute, and utterly inescapable. The morning after the attempted poisoning, the master suite was transformed into a showroom of silent, shimmering luxury. Heavy garment bags hung from the gold-leafed racks, and velvet-lined boxes of jewelry cluttered the ivory vanity. Sung-min had not asked for her measurements, he had simply known them. He watched from the doorway as Gracie moved tentatively among the silks, her fingers brushing against fabrics that cost more than a year of her previous salary.
"Tonight is the Autumn Foundation Gala," Sung-min stated, his voice clipping through the room's silence. "The entire city will be there. Our rivals, our partners, and the families who still think they can whisper behind my back." He walked toward her, pulling a specific bag from the rack. He unzipped it to reveal a dress the color of a fresh wound. It was a deep, defiant crimson, tailored to cling to her every curve and highlight the soft swell of her pregnancy. "I can't go to a gala, Sung-min," Gracie whispered, looking at the bold fabric. "I'm the maid who disappeared. People will recognize me. They'll talk." "Let them talk," he countered, his eyes darkening as he stepped into her space. "They will see that you aren't just a woman I kept. You are the woman I chose. You will wear this and you will stand by my side. You are the only person in that room who has what they all want, my future." The transformation took hours. When the stylist Sung-min had hired finally stepped away, Gracie stared at the stranger in the mirror. Her skin glowed against the red silk, and a necklace of teardrop rubies sat heavy against her collarbone. She looked like royalty, but the rigidity in her shoulders betrayed the terrified girl underneath. When they arrived at the grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel, the air seemed to vanish. As the massive doors opened, the roar of conversation died a slow, jagged death. Gracie felt 100 pairs of eyes fix on her. She was the only black woman in a room filled with the pale, high society elite of Seoul. She felt the weight of their judgment, the sharp stabs of their curiosity, and the simmering resentments of the women who had spent years trying to secure the spot she now occupied. She instinctively tried to shrink back, but Sung-min's hand found her. He didn't just hold her hand, he wrapped a heavy arm around her waist, his palms splaying flat and firm over her pregnant belly. It was a gesture of absolute public ownership. "Head up, Gracie," he murmured into her ear, his breath a warm contrast to the icy stares of the crowd. "You are the most powerful woman in this room because I say you are." They moved through the ballroom like a storm front. Sung-min didn't let her go for a single second. When a high-ranking government official approached to offer a stiff greeting, Sung-min's hand remained on her stomach, his thumb tracing small, possessive circles over the fabric. He spoke of business with a cold, detached brilliance, but his body was entirely focused on the woman tucked against his side. A group of socialites watched them from the bar, their whispers loud enough to carry. "Is that the girl from the estate? The servant?" one hissed, her eyes scanning Gracie's rubies with pure envy. Sung-min stopped mid-sentence. He didn't look at the women, but his grip on Gracie tightened, pulling her flush against his hip. He turned his head just enough for his profile to be visible to them, his expression of sharp, predatory warning. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by a frantic, shuffling silence. "Are you tired, Gracie?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register that excluded everyone else in the room. "My feet ache. Sung-min, everyone is staring. I feel like a specimen." "They aren't staring at a specimen," he corrected, his gaze sweeping the room with a look of supreme arrogance. "They are staring at the only thing I have ever found worth protecting. They are looking at the Borum Queen." He led her to a private table on the raised dais, a position that overlooked the entire ballroom. He sat her down, but remained standing behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his fingers occasionally drifting down to touch the back of her neck or the curve of her stomach. He was marking her in front of the world, building a wall of silk and blood around her that no one dared to breach. As the music played, Gracie realized that the red dress wasn't just a gift, it was a flag. Sung-min had draped her in his color, showing his enemies and his allies alike that the Maid was gone. In her place was a woman who was shielded by the most dangerous man in Korea. A man whose obsession had grown so large it left no room for her to ever be invisible again. The days following the gala were marked by a new kind of intensity. The master suite had become a classroom, though the subject was far more dangerous than simple vocabulary. Soon Min had cleared his schedule, ignoring the frantic calls of his lieutenants, to sit across from Gracie at the heavy mahogany desk. In front of her lay a stack of papers, but there were no nursery rhymes or basic greetings on them. There were directives. "Again," Soon Min said, his voice as sharp as a blade. "But this time, do not look at the floor. Look at me." Gracie swallowed hard, her hand resting on the swell of her stomach. "주방을 청소하세요," she whispered. "Clean the kitchen." Soon Min's hand shot across the desk, not to strike, but to tilt her chin upward until her eyes met his dark, uncompromising gaze. "No, that was a request. You sounded like you were asking for permission to exist. In this house, you are the highest authority beneath me. If you speak to the staff like a servant, they will treat you like one, and I will not have my son's mother looked down upon." He stood, walking behind her chair, his hands settled on her shoulders, his thumbs pressing into the tension there. The language of the Borum family is not just Korean, Gracie, it is power. You have spent 3 years saying please and sorry to people who weren't fit to breathe your air. That ends today. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "The mother of my child does not ask, she commands. Try again. Call for Mrs. Park." Gracie took a deep breath, trying to summon the fire she had seen in Soon Min during the gala. She pressed the intercom button on the desk. "Park Bisonim 당장 이리 오세요." "Mrs. Park, come here immediately." Seconds later, the head housekeeper appeared at the door, her face pale, her posture stiff with the fear that had become a permanent fixture among the staff. She bowed low, her eyes fixed on the rug. "Tell her the flowers in the vase are dying," Sungmin prompted softly, his hands sliding down to rest possessively on Gracie's pregnant belly. "Tell her that her negligence is an insult to the life growing inside you." Gracie looked at Mrs. Park, the woman who had once made her scrub the same floor 3 times just to assert dominance. Gracie felt the old fear flicker, but then she felt the heat of Sungmin's palms against her skin. She felt the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of her child, and the fear began to calcify into something colder, something stronger. "The lilies are wilted," Gracie said, her voice rising, gaining a firm, melodic edge she hadn't known she possessed. "Koto bakuseo, dangjang. Change the flowers, now." Mrs. Park flinched, her bow deepening until she was almost doubled over. "죄송합니다, madame. I will fix it at once." "Do not apologize," Gracie snapped, the Korean words flowing with a sudden, jagged precision. "Just do it." The housekeeper scurried away, and the silence that followed was heavy. Gracie felt a rush of adrenaline, a dark thrill that made her dizzy. She looked up at Sungmin, expecting to see his usual mask of indifference. Instead, she found a terrifying pride. He was looking at her as if she were a weapon he had finally finished sharpening. "Good," he whispered, his grip tightening on her waist. "You are learning. Language is the first wall we build. When they hear your voice, they should hear the sound of their own fate. Never forget that these people are not your friends. They are your subjects." He pulled her up from the chair, turning her to face him. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb, his gaze dropping to her lips. "I am building an empire for this child, Gracie. But a king needs a queen who can hold the sword when he is weary.
By the time this baby is born, you will not remember what it feels like to be invisible." Gracie looked into his eyes and realized with a shiver of dread that she was losing herself. The invisible maid was being systematically dismantled, replaced by a woman who knew how to wield a man's cruelty as her own. Sungmin wasn't just teaching her a language, he was rewriting her soul, ensuring that the only person she would ever have to answer to was him. "Say it," he commanded, his forehead resting against hers. "Tell me who you are." Gracie didn't hesitate this time. The words felt like iron in her mouth. "I am a Boram." Sungmin smiled, a slow, predatory baring of teeth. He kissed her then, a hard, possessive claim that tasted of sandalwood and the cold finality of power. Outside the room, the staff moved in hushed silence, terrified of the woman whose voice now echoed with the same lethal authority as the boss.
The silence of the Boram estate was never truly peaceful. It was a heavy, engineered stillness that spoke of absolute control. But tonight, with Sung Men away in Busan to settle a territorial dispute, the quiet felt jagged. Gracie sat in the center of the newly finished nursery, a room that had once been a cold storage closet when she was a maid. Now it was a sanctuary of cream-colored silk and hand-carved mahogany, filled with the scent of lavender and expensive wood. She ran her hand over the velvet lining of the crib, her mind drifting to the language lessons. "I am a Boram." The words felt like a shield, but as the clock struck midnight, a sudden sharp sound echoed from the vents, a metallic click that didn't belong to the house's natural rhythm. Gracie froze. Her pulse, once steady, began to race. She looked at the nursery door. The two guards Sung Men had left behind were elite, but the silence from the hallway was too perfect. It was the silence of a grave. She stood up, her hand instinctively covering the swell of her stomach. A shadow flickered beneath the door. It wasn't the rhythmic pacing of a guard. It was the slow, deliberate shadow of someone checking a lock. Then came the sound of a suppressed gunshot, a soft pft, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the carpet. Terror, cold and visceral, surged through her. She was trapped on the third floor. But then, the invisible maid inside her stirred. For 3 years, she had navigated this mansion through the veins the Borams never looked at. She knew the narrow service tunnels behind the lath and plaster, the secret ways the staff moved to ensure the masters never had to see the work being done. She scrambled to the back of the nursery, pushing aside a heavy tapestry of a sleeping dragon. Behind it was a small wooden latch, a laundry chute disguised as a decorative panel. It was a tight fit for her pregnant frame, but fear made her small. She slipped inside just as the nursery door was kicked off its hinges. From the darkness of the chute, she heard the intruder's heavy boots on the hardwood. "Where is she?" a voice rasped, in a dialect that sounded like Jin Sung's men. "The boss said the bitch doesn't leave this room alive." Gracie didn't breathe. She slid down the internal service ladder, her fingers catching on splinters, her cashmere dress tearing against the rough wood. She landed in the narrow crawl space between the kitchen and the formal dining room. It was dusty and smelled of old grease, a place where she had once hidden to eat scraps of leftover kimbap. Through a tiny knothole in the wood, she saw the silhouette of a man with a jagged scar across his throat. He held a silenced pistol, his eyes scanning the darkness. He was inches away from her, separated only by a thin layer of lath and plaster. Gracie pressed her back against the brickwork, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "Protect the air," Sung Min's voice echoed in her head, no longer a command but an instinct. She moved with the silence of a ghost, navigating the pitch-black tunnel toward the basement. She knew there was a heavy steel door in the wine cellar that led to the garage, but she also knew the intruder would be expecting her to head for the exits. Instead, she climbed upward, moving toward the one place no one would think to look for a fleeing woman, the security hub in the attic. Her lungs burned and her muscles screamed, but she kept moving. When she finally reached the attic panel, she burst through, gasping for air.
The room was filled with glowing monitors showing every corner of the estate. On the screens, she saw 3 more men in black tacticals moving through the master suite, ripping the silk sheets she had slept on just hours ago. She reached for the emergency transmitter on the desk, the one Sung Min had told her was for the end of the world. She pressed the button and spoke into the receiver, her voice not trembling, but hard with the authority he had beaten into her soul. "This is Gracie Borum," she said, the name finally fitting her mouth like a weapon. "The estate is breached. 3 intruders on the 3rd floor, 1 in the kitchen. Send everyone, and tell my husband to hurry home. I have a mess for him to clean up." She watched the monitors as the estate's secondary perimeter guards, men hidden in the tree line, finally swarmed a house. The assassins realized the trap too late. When the front doors finally burst open an hour later, it wasn't the guards she saw first, it was Sung Min. He looked like a man possessed, his suit coat gone, his shirt stained with someone else's blood, his eyes wide with a frantic, soul-deep terror she had never seen before. He found her in the attic, sitting in the high-backed security chair, watching the feeds as the last of the intruders were dragged away. He didn't say a word. He crossed the room in 2 strides, falling to his knees and burying his face against her pregnant belly, his hands trembling as he gripped her waist. "I thought," he choked out, his voice breaking for the first time, "I thought I had lost everything." Gracie placed her hand on his head, her fingers threading through his dark hair. She wasn't the maid who needed a hero anymore. She was the shadow in the walls, the woman who had survived the dark. "I told you, Sung Min," she whispered, looking down at the monitors where her enemies lay defeated. "The mother of your child doesn't ask for mercy. She takes what is hers." In the cold light of the security screens, Sung Min looked up at her, and the obsession in his eyes was no longer just for the heir, it was for her. He realized then that he hadn't just caged a woman, he had unleashed a queen.
The aftermath of the assassination attempt left the Baram estate in a state of permanent mobilization, but the true war was brewing in the dark alleys of the shipping district. Sung Min had spent 48 hours in his study, the air thick with the scent of bitter espresso and the ozone of high-end surveillance equipment. He emerged only to touch Gracie's stomach, a silent, grounding ritual that seemed to be the only thing keeping his humanity tethered. The ultimatum arrived at dawn, delivered not by courier, but by a hacked broadcast onto every screen in the mansion. It was the Zhou family, a rival syndicate that had long coveted Sung Min's control over the Incheon ports. Their leader, a man with a voice like grinding gravel, laid out the terms with clinical coldness. "You have expanded too far, Baram," the voice echoed through the master suite. "Your focus is divided by a foreign maid and a half-blood heir. Relinquish the northern territory and the shipping codes by midnight, or we will turn that mansion into a funeral pyre. Choose your empire or your woman. You cannot have both." Gracie stood by the window, her hand trembling as she watched the sun rise over a city that felt like a cage. She looked at Sung Min, expecting to see the calculating strategist weighing the cost of his kingdom. Territory was blood in his world. Without it, he was just a man with a target on his back. "Sung Min," she whispered, her voice thick with the fear of being the reason for his downfall. "The shipping codes, the territory, it's what your father died for. You can't just—" Sung Min crossed the room, his movements fluid and lethal. He didn't look at the screen, he looked only at her. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the dark circles under her eyes. "They think they are giving me a choice," he murmured, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "They think my love for you is a weakness they can bargain with. They are about to learn that it is the most destructive force they have ever encountered."
He didn't call a meeting. He didn't negotiate. Instead, he gathered his eaters, the elite strike team reserved for total annihilation. By 11 p.m., the Joe family sat in their primary warehouse, surrounded by crates of illicit cargo and a small army of mercenaries, waiting for the digital transfer of power. They expected a defeated man. They expected a surrender. Instead, the lights cut out.
The warehouse didn't fall to a siege, it fell to an execution. Sungmin didn't send his men in first. He walked through the front bay doors alone, silhouetted by the moonlight, a single flare in his hand. The mercenaries raised their weapons, but before they could fire, the high-pressure sprinkler system began to hiss. It wasn't water that sprayed from the ceiling, it was high-grade accelerant. The rival leader stepped forward, his face pale in the dim light. "You're insane, Borum. You'll burn with us. Give us the codes." Sungmin looked at the man, his expression one of bored, aristocratic disdain. He thought of Gracie in the nursery, her hand on her belly, her life hanging on his ability to be a monster. "You asked me to choose between my empire and my woman," Sungmin said, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "But you forgot one thing. She is my empire, and I don't negotiate with thieves." He dropped the flare. The roar of the ignition was instantaneous. A wall of orange fire surged upward, turning the warehouse into a furnace. Sungmin turned his back on the screaming men in the exploding grates, walking toward his waiting car with a slow, rhythmic pace that didn't falter even as the windows behind him shattered from the heat. As the car pulled away, the rear-view mirror reflected a pillar of fire that could be seen from the heart of Seoul. He had destroyed the territory rather than trade her for it. He had chosen to rule a smaller kingdom of ash as long as she was at its center. When he returned to the estate, smelling of smoke and the cold night air, he found Gracie waiting at the top of the stairs. He walked up to her, his suit ruined, his face smudged with soot. He didn't say a word about the millions of dollars he had just incinerated or the power vacuum he had created. He simply pulled her into his arms, his face buried in her hair, his heart beating a frantic, obsessive rhythm against her own. "It's done," he whispered. "There is no more choice. There is only us." Gracie clung to him, the heat from his body warming her chilled skin. She realized then that Sungmin Borum wasn't a man who played by the rules of the world. He was a man who would burn the world to the ground just to make sure she had a warm place to sleep. It was a terrifying, beautiful devotion, and she knew there was no going back. The smell of smoke still clung to the vents of the Borum estate, a lingering reminder of the warehouse Sungmin had reduced to ash. But as the external fires died, the internal rot finally reached its boiling point. Gracie had retreated to the lower levels of the mansion, seeking the cool, thick-walled silence of the basement pantry to escape the suffocating tension of the master suite. She was reaching for a bottle of water when the heavy steel door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing like a guillotine blade. "You really are a beautiful complication, Gracie," a voice drawled from the shadows. Jin Sung stepped into the dim light of the overhead bulb, his face bruised from the previous encounter with his brother, his eyes bloodshot and erratic. He wasn't the polished syndicate prince anymore. He was a man who had lost his inheritance and his mind. In his hand, he held a sleek black pistol, the muzzle pointed directly at the center of Gracie's red dress. Gracie backed away, her heels clicking against the concrete floor until her spine hit the cold metal shelving. She moved her hand instinctively, covering her stomach, her heart hammering so violently she felt lightheaded. "Jin Sung, don't do this. Sungmin will—" "Sungmin is busy dealing with the fallout of his own insanity," Jin Sung screamed, his voice cracking. "He burned the ports for you. He threw away 30 years of tradition for a maid. My father didn't build this empire to have it handed over to a bastard child who doesn't even belong in this country." He stepped closer, the gun shaking in his grip. "If you and that thing inside you disappear, he'll be forced to look at me again. He'll realize I'm the only legacy he has left." Gracie felt the sharp edge of a shelf digging into her back. She thought of the service tunnels, the language of power, and the queen Sung Min had tried to build. She forced her chin up, looking Jin Sung in the eye. "You think killing me makes you a leader. It makes you a corpse. You know exactly what he'll do to you." "He'll have to find you first," Jin Sung hissed, thumbing the safety off. The heavy door didn't just open, it exploded inward, the hinges screaming as they were torn from the frame. A single gunshot rang out, not aimed at Jin Sung, but at the light bulb above his head. The room plunged into a terrifying, flickering strobe. Before Jin Sung could pull the trigger, a shadow moved with the speed of a strike team ghost. A heavy boot connected with Jin Sung's wrist, sending his weapon skittering across the concrete. A second later, the air was sucked out of the room by the sheer presence of Sung Min Boram. He didn't scream, he didn't roar, he moved with a terrifying, silent precision. In one fluid motion, Sung Min stepped between the gun and Gracie, pulling her rigid body against his chest. It was the moment that would be burned into the memory of the Boram household forever. Sung Min stood like a titan of vengeance, his suit perfectly pressed despite the chaos, his face a mask of unreadable, cold restraint. His left arm was wrapped firmly around Gracie's midsection, his hand resting possessively on her pregnant belly, feeling the frantic pulse of his air beneath the silk. His other arm was fully extended, holding his custom handgun with calm, lethal precision, aimed squarely at his brother's forehead. Gracie stood frozen, her shoulders raised, her eyes wide with the shock of being caught between instinctive maternal protection and the man who was acting as both her shield and her greatest threat. She could feel the heat radiating off Sung Min, the vibration of his breathing, and the absolute stillness of his hand on her stomach.
"I gave you a choice, Jin Sung," Sung Min said, his voice a low, melodic whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "I told you that if you even cast a shadow over her, I would erase you." "She's a servant, Sung Min," Jin Sung sobbed, cowering on the floor. "She's nothing." "To the world, perhaps," Sung Min murmured, his finger tightening on the trigger, his gaze never wavering from his brother's eyes. "But to me, she is the only thing that is real, and you just tried to kill my reality." The silence in the basement was suffocating, broken only by Jin Sung's ragged breathing. Sung Min didn't look at Gracie, but his hand squeezed her belly slightly, a silent reassurance that he had her, that the world was under his control. He looked like a man accustomed to violence, acting with the calculated restraint of a king deciding the fate of a traitor. "Get out," Sung Min said finally, his voice dropping to a register that made the concrete seem to tremble. "Run. If you are still in this country by sunset, I won't use a gun. I'll make sure you feel every second of what it means to betray the Boram name." Jin Sung scrambled for the door, fleeing into the darkness. Sung Min didn't lower the gun until the sound of his brother's footsteps had vanished. Only then did he turn to Gracie. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply tucked her head under his chin, his hand still resting on the life they had created together. Gracie leaned into him, her hands clutching his lapels. She realized then that she was no longer caught between danger and safety. In Sung Min's arms, they were the same thing. She was the protected, and he was the monster, and together they were untouchable. The basement confrontation had been the final fracture in the old order of the Boram household. In the days that followed, a terrifying, silent efficiency settled over the estate.
Sung Min did not raise his voice, and he did not issue public decrees. Instead, he moved through his life like a reaper in a tailored suit. He had realized that protecting the heir wasn't enough. To truly keep Gracie safe, he had to burn away every shadow of dissent, every lingering look of judgment that reminded her of the maid she once was. The purge began in the kitchen. Gracie was sitting at the breakfast nook, her hands wrapped around a mug of herbal tea, when Sung Min entered with a list in his hand. He didn't look at the tea. He looked at the 3 junior maids and the sous chef standing by the industrial range. These were the ones who had whispered in the hallways, the ones who had deliberately left Gracie's favorite Nigerian spices at the back of the pantry to make her feel unwelcome.
Out, Sung Min said. He didn't point and he didn't explain. Your things have already been moved to the gate. Your final payments are in the envelopes by the door. If I see your faces within 10 miles of this district again, the consequences will be permanent. The sous chef began to protest, his face reddening. Mr. Borum, I've served this family for 10 years. Sung Min's gaze shifted to the man, his eyes turning into shards of black glass. You served the Borum name while mocking the woman who carries it. That makes your 10 years an insult, not a service. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to that lethal melodic register. I saw the way you looked at her yesterday when she asked for more pepper. You looked at her like she was still scrubbing your floors. She is the mother of the next boss. You are a man who cooks eggs. Know the difference before I decide to bridge the gap between your life and your end. The kitchen staff fled in a panicked scramble. Gracie watched, her heart thudding, as the people she had once feared were erased from her world with a single sentence. But the purge didn't stop with the staff. That evening, Sung Min summoned the senior board of the Borum Syndicate to the formal library. These were the men who had been with his father, the traditionalists who had openly questioned the purity of the bloodline Gracie was carrying. They sat in the heavy leather chairs, smelling of cigars and old money, their expressions tight with a pride they thought was untouchable. Sung Min didn't sit. He stood by the fireplace, the orange glow casting long, demonic shadows across his face. He held a glass of whiskey, but he didn't drink. I've noticed a recurring theme in our recent meetings, Sung Min began, his tone deceptively conversational. A hesitation, a certain lack of enthusiasm regarding the security protocols for my wife. Sung Min, one of the elders started, a man who had known Sung Min since he was a child. We only worry about the optics. A foreign girl, a servant, it weakens our image with the other families. They see it as a distraction. Sung Min's glass shattered in his hand. He didn't flinch as the amber liquid and shards of crystal fell to the hearth. He turned to the elder, his face a mask of such raw, focused menace that the room went cold. Distraction? Whispered Sung Min. He walked toward the man, leaning over the desk until they were inches apart. My brother thought she was a distraction. He is currently begging for his life in a container ship headed for the coast of Africa. Do you wish to join him? The elder's mouth went dry. He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat.
You look at her and see a maid, Sung Min said, his voice rising with a terrifying intensity. I look at her and see the only person who has ever seen the man behind the monster. I see the mother of my legacy. From this moment on, if any of you so much as blinks with disrespect in her presence, if I hear a single word of doubt about her status, I will consider it an act of treason, and you know how I handle traitors. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of resignation letters, already drafted. He dropped them on the table. Sign them. You're retired. Your pensions will be paid as long as you remain silent and invisible. If you stay in Seoul, stay in the shadows, because the next time I see judgment in your eyes, it will be the last thing you ever see. One by one, the men who had ruled the city for decades signed the papers with shaking hands and shuffled out of the room. When the library was finally empty, Sung Min walked up to the master suite.
he found Gracie standing on the balcony, looking out over the city. He walked up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his palms settling over her stomach with that familiar, heavy possessiveness. "It's done," he murmured into her hair. "The house is clean, Gracie. No one is left who doesn't know exactly who you are." Gracie leaned back into him, a sense of peace finally settling over her. She realized then that Sung-min wasn't just clearing the room, he was clearing her path. He was removing every ghost of her past so she could finally inhabit the future he had built for her. "They're all gone?" she asked softly. "Everyone who didn't deserve to see you," he replied, kissing the side of her neck. "From now on, the only eyes on you will be mine, and I promise you, I will never look away." The estate was quiet now, but it wasn't the jagged silence of fear. It was the absolute, reverent silence of a kingdom that finally knew its queen. The heavy silence of the Boram estate was finally broken, not by the sound of gunfire or shifting alliances, but by a thin, sharp wail that echoed through the master suite. It was a sound of absolute life, piercing the sterile, high-stakes world Sung-min had built. Gracie lay back against the silk pillows, her skin damp and her body exhausted, but for the first time in 9 months, the weight in her chest was gone. The transition from maid to mother, from prey to partner, was complete. As the private medical team quietly cleared the room, the only person who remained was the man who had burned an empire to ensure this moment happened.
Sung-min didn't move with his usual calculated speed. He approached the small bundle of white linen with a reverence that bordered on fear. When he finally picked up his son, the youngest Boram heir, the shift was total. The man who had held a gun with unshakable precision now held a 6-pound infant with trembling hands. He walked over to the edge of the bed and sat beside Gracie. He didn't look at her immediately. He was staring at the tiny, perfect face of a boy who carried the legacy of 2 worlds. The baby had Gracie's nose and Sung-min's dark, almond-shaped eyes, a living bridge between the woman who had once scrubbed his floors and the man who ruled the city. "He's perfect," Gracie whispered, her voice tired but steady. Sung-min finally looked at her, and the terrifying obsession that had defined their relationship had evolved. It was no longer just about possession. It was about a fierce, protective devotion. He leaned over and kissed her forehead, his lips lingering there. "He is a king," Sung-min murmured, "and he has his mother's strength." A few hours later, the heavy mahogany doors of the formal grand hall were thrown open. The high-ranking members of the syndicate, those who had survived the purge, were gathered in a silent, symmetrical line. They stood in the space where Gracie had once carried trays of tea and ignored their insults. The room was cold, lit by the amber glow of the massive chandeliers, but the temperature rose the moment Sung-min and Gracie appeared at the top of the dais. Sung-min sat in the high-backed velvet chair that had served as the Boram throne for generations. But today, he wasn't alone. Gracie sat beside him, dressed in a gown of midnight blue that flowed like water, her hand resting on the arm of his chair, her fingers intertwined with his. In his arms, Sung-min held the heir, wrapped in the family's ceremonial black silk. The syndicate members bowed. It wasn't the shallow, forced bow they had given her months ago. It was the deep, submissive arc of men who knew their lives depended on the woman sitting on that dais. "Look at them," Sung-min said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, cold and commanding. "This is the Boram dynasty. There is no maid here. There is no foreigner. There is only my family. My son is the future, and Gracie is the heart of this empire. Anyone who cannot see that is already dead to me."
Gracie looked out over the bowed heads of the men who had once looked through her as if she were made of glass. She felt Sung Men's grip tighten on her hand, a silent anchor in the storm of power they now commanded. She wasn't the girl from Houston who had been afraid of the dark anymore. She was the woman who had tamed the monster and inherited his kingdom. The baby stirred in Sung Min's arms, letting out a small, soft sound. Sung Min looked down at his son, then at his wife, a slow, rare smile touching his lips, the smile of a man who had finally found something worth more than territory or blood. They were no longer master and maid. They were no longer captor and prisoner. As the city of Seoul glittered outside the windows, they stood at the precipice of a new era. They were a family, forged in fire and bound by a love that the world would eventually learn to fear. The real storm was over, and in its wake, the new dynasty had begun.